All right. Hello and Happy New Year. 2020 was a difficult and challenging time. I'm sure everybody's glad to see it pass and looking forward to 2021. I'd like to welcome everybody to today's webinar presentation on the current state of the revision process for the ASTM E1527 standard. The presentation will be made available on our website at erisinfo.com. If you have not heard, ERIS and GeoSearch have merged, and future webinar presentations will be conducted under the ERIS banner. A certificate of attendance will be provided for today's presentation. I will explain after about how you can obtain a copy of the certificate. The question and answer section will be held at the end of the presentation. Please submit questions in the question box located in the lower part of the Zoom screen. The questions will be read aloud and then answered. Today's speaker is Julie Kilgore, President of Wasatch Environmental and Chair of the ASTM E1527 Task Group. She has over 25 years of experience in environmental assessment, investigation, remediation, and regulatory agency coordination. Today, Julie will be discussing the potential modifications that environmental professionals and users should be aware of as the review and balloting process nears its conclusion. Julie, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Scott. And thank you, everybody. It's great to be here. Our task group has been underway for a couple of years. I'll talk a little bit about what we've been doing and give you some insight on some of the things that we've been talking about that we anticipate will successfully make its way through the end of our balloting process. I wanted to briefly just give you an overall timeline, just as a reminder of how this all plays out together. As you know, we all have our underlying CERCLA legislation, Superfund amendments. The first 1527 was published in 1993. We have some lender liability protections in 96, but the one that really changed, the legislation that really changed the trajectory of Phase I environmental site assessments and the applicability of it is the Brownfields Bill in 2002. It was out of the Brownfields bill that there's a requirement for EPA to develop an all appropriate inquiries regulation, which EPA did in 2005. Simultaneously, ASTM was working on updates to the 1527 to meet those anything that was in the regulation that we didn't already have covered. So in 2005, we have a new regulation that then references the 1527 as a tool for complying with all appropriate inquiries. In 2013, the ASTM task group published a revision. EPA then referenced that 2013 version as a tool for complying with the all appropriate inquiries regulation. And that is the same process that we're going through now. We'll talk a bit about that revision process here. Under ASTM, there's a requirement to look at standards every so many years. For our particular purpose for 1527, that our task group was initially established in 1990 for the sole purpose of defining what is good commercial customary practice for conducting all appropriate inquiries. That phrase, good commercial and customary practice, is built into the legislation. That is our mandate as a task group and a key part of our objective. And that's important as I talk about some of the revisions that we're looking at for the upcoming standards. So as I mentioned, it was first published in 1993. And then there were several revisions afterwards as we continue through the modification process. The thing that's important to remember, because I've seen some publications and some e-newsletters and email blasts giving different dates as to when the 2013 version of the standard expires or sunsets. We're good through the end of this year. There's an 8-year shelf life, so to speak, on any ASTM standard. And so 2013, of course, we're good through the end of 2021 or until revised, whichever occurs first. And even then, if we are not successful in getting it completely across the finish line by the end of 2021, ASTM has some flexibility in keeping the 2013 version active and viable until we get finished with our process. So rest assured, the 2013 version is fine for now until we get done with our revision process. Well, so what is that revision process? So universally, ASTM has these requirements for all their standards. There's a maximum 8-year shelf life. And the point of that is to ensure that ASTM is promulgating standards that have market relevance, right? So we have 3 different options basically when we're looking at a standard. One is that we take no action and just let the standard sunset. There's no more market relevance. We don't need this standard anymore. And that certainly is not the case with the 1527. We could just ballot and reapprove with no changes to the standard. Everything's working fine. There is no need to change anything. That's just not my life. We're always looking at ways that we can improve things. And so then the third option, of course, is to reconvene the task group and undergo a revision effort. And that's what we've been doing. So our task group we formally convened 2-3 years ago, February of 2018. 2 primary objectives: direct what we do, clarifying existing language where we're seeing confusion in the marketplace, and then something we hear every time we look at the standard, and that is to please write better reports, strengthen the deliverable, more clarity, better quality information, better reproducibility. We have about 250 people on the task group. We had a number of initial focus groups looking at specific issues. And then now we're have been coming together as a task group to act on the recommendations that were coming from various focus groups that we were incorporating into the standard. So we've had a couple of ballots. We had our initial subcommittee ballot in September of 2019. We worked through a lot of really good comments that came in. We put another ballot out in September of 2020. We have been meeting on almost a weekly basis to get through those. Our discussions are ongoing. I'm anticipating that we'll have another ballot go out probably the end of February as we just make our way through so that we can have an updated standard by the end of 2021. Yep, so we're anticipating that 1527, I said mid-2021 and maybe a little bit later, depending on our balloting, and then EPA's final rule process will kick in to reference the 1527. EPA, we have Patricia Overmeyer, who's our EPA liaison, who actively participates in our task group calls. In the last ballot round, she had an EPA legal review of the ballot changes just to see if there were any showstoppers that would perhaps trigger a concern for referencing the standard. So EPA has been involved all along, and that really helps us get this through that final piece of referencing the updated standard. So what are our revision drivers? As a high level, federal law requires all appropriate inquiries be conducted consistent with good commercial customary practice. Well, what is that, right? So we want to be very mindful of what is it that people are doing? What is good commercial and customary practice? The ASTM process, it's a process of consensus among users and producers to agree on a consistent process that's expected to result in a consistent deliverable. I mean, you could apply that to any ASTM standard. It's that consistency that we're looking for a consistent deliverable, another really key driver. Inconsistencies in process and quality, those are our signals of areas where the standard can be improved. And then we also have group of attorneys on our task group that they're such a great resource to help us be aware of recent litigation and claims. That also provides insight for areas where the standard can be improved. Where are things going wrong? And is there something we need to do in the standard to help with that? These 4 key drivers are really important backdrops to some of the language that I'll share with you today. So what to expect in upcoming revisions? We're always trying to cleaning up the definitions of the recognized environmental condition, the controlled recognized environmental condition, the historical recognized environmental condition. Those are such key components of the outcome that, you know, we want that to be clear, so we're coming up with consistent conclusions in that phase 1 process. You know, I mean, it starts with this: what the heck is a REC, right? What is that? Well, of course, we know recognized environmental condition, the presence or likely presence of a hazardous substance or petroleum products at a property under conditions of a release, right? We know it's there. Under conditions indicative of a release, we have information that suggests it's likely to be there, or a material threat of a future release. But it can be complicated, right? There are a lot of nuances and factors that environmental professionals have to think through. One of them that we're working on right now, and what you may see in the new standard, is a definition of likely, right? And so we've had a focus group working on that to hammer out, what does it mean? It's not like, you know, we could be hit by an asteroid tomorrow, right? Everything's possible. So trying to put some parameters around likely. On the far other end of interpretation are those who say, look, if you don't know it's there, you can't call it a REC. You have no data, you have no proof, you have no evidence. So in between those 2 extremes, we've been working on this definition of what it means to be likely. So stay tuned for that. We'll see if that makes it through the balloting rounds. Because remember, proof is not required to meet this test of likely. We have to apply professional judgment. And I'll give a couple of examples where we've seen different conclusions out of the same set of facts. Here we have a gas station that operated on a property from the 40s through the 70s. There's no records regarding the tanks or releases, right? Because this was all pre-regulation. Who was looking? And I've seen reports that have said that. You had a gas station here in that time period, but there's no reports of releases in the government records. So therefore, we have no reason to conclude that this represents a recognized environmental condition. Okay, well, there was no regulatory agency overseeing these activities at that time. Really, the gut check the environmental professional has to ask themselves is, what's the likelihood? If I went out there and drilled, what is the likelihood that I'm going to encounter contamination? Another example would be the dry cleaners. That's been a huge, huge point of discussion among environmental professionals, users, SBA, regulators. Dry cleaners are a challenge, and information that has come to our task group from a variety of sources, from multiple sources, is if you go out, again, that gut check, if you go out and drill or collect vapor samples, or however you're evaluating for the potential for a release, what's the likelihood you're going to find actionable levels of contamination? And from a variety of sources for these dry cleaners, and technology is changing, and this may be a different answer in a few years, but right now the information coming to the task group is that you've got a better than 80% chance that you're going to find something at that current or past dry cleaner operation. So that starts to look pretty likely, just based on industry feedback. So can likely be defined, and I think we're getting pretty close to being able to incorporate that in the next revision. The REC versus the HREC versus the CREC, right? One of the things that we hammer into to our environmental professionals, you have to have the recognized environmental condition first before you can transition to a historical REC or a controlled REC, right? You have to meet that REC test first. I had impacts on my property. So then the historical recognized environmental condition, right? You have the past release affecting the subject property. This is a piece that we built into the upcoming revision because people were calling releases on offsite properties that had no bearing on the subject property, never impacted the subject property. And they were calling those offsite releases HRECs. Past releases affecting the subject property that have been addressed to unrestricted use criteria. And we have to consider the current regulatory framework to make sure those numbers are still appropriate for unrestricted use. HRECs are not RECs. Once we had contamination here, now it's either all gone or at concentrations that nobody cares, right? Unrestricted use. Affecting the subject property was a key, incorporating that phrase was key. And it's actually even more important for the controlled rec. It's a similar situation, past release, affecting the subject property, addressed to some non-residential standard or some unrestricted use criteria subject to some kind of control. It meets commercial, you know, or you can't drink the water, or you have to have a cap or whatever. And this was important because consultants, we were seeing reports where consultants were, again, identifying offsite releases as controlled recognized environmental conditions. And the problem with that is that decision, by definition, means that your subject property is subject to some kind of control, which of course was not the case when it was affecting another property and not yours. So it was important to get this right. Past releases affecting the subject property addressed to some unrestricted or to some kind of restricted use criteria subject to some type of control. Controlled RECs are a subset of RECs, right? Because they meet that presence test, presence or likely presence. Yeah, you have contamination here. You've had a release here. Which is why it has to go into the conclusion section of the report. None of that changes. There's some explanatory language, some clarifications. Make sure you're talking about your property, impacts to your property. A release from an offsite source can indeed represent a controlled recognized environmental condition for your property if you have residual contamination on your property. Another thing that we've been working on that I think we have a pretty good likelihood of success is a new appendix that walks through that decision-making process. Any of you who've been through some of my trainings or presentations, you've seen the decision matrix, the boxes of walking through an endpoint of a REC, HREC, CREC, or de minimis. So we were taking that box and creating an appendix out of that, a flow chart with some examples, very simple examples. We're not getting into the complexities, but just simple examples of how these apply. So another item that we're looking at is that we had to address another challenge were the third-party provided environmental lien and activity and use limitation searches. Now keep in mind the search of land title records has always been a user responsibility because they have title professionals who are doing this already through the normal course of obtaining title insurance. And we've always said that in Section 6, going all the way back to 1993. That's a user responsibility. Now, there are situations, as it says in Section 6 of the standard, there are situations when a user opts to contract with the environmental professional to contract with a title professional, again, emphasizing the importance of using a title professional to research land title records. But that's a user option to do that. So what had happened is there were some third-party vendors who started to offer this as a service to environmental professionals. But there were some different interpretations of the standard about researching land title, searching, it wasn't environmental liens, because if you got a multi-million-dollar lien from EPA recorded against a property, no one's going to miss that, right? It really was it was specifically the activity and use limitations. And what was intended in the standard is that we have an obligation to identify activity and use limitations that are currently recorded against or relating to the property. And the interpretation was, well, we only need to look at current owner records. We don't need to go back. And what we found, what came to our attention is that these activity and use limitations, these deed restrictions that were filed back 2 or 3 property owners ago, weren't getting picked up in these third-party AUL searches. So we had to fix that. So we just added some language, make sure you're going back to 1980 so that we're picking up the AULs. But this only, so we were getting these inconsistent deliverables and activity and use limitations were getting missed. So, but remember, this is only a problem if the environmental professional, if the user asks the environmental professional to contract to get this information. So you go back up to bullet 1 on the presentation here. This has always been a user responsibility. So it's important for environmental professionals to understand what the problem was that we needed to solve in the standard, so that if environmental professionals are asked or contracted to do these AUL searches, you need to understand what you're getting, what you need to get, and the questions you're trying to get answered. Let's see, what else to expect? Records review. So we, again, one of the things we were seeing in reports was environmental professionals dutifully putting in information in the appropriate sections, but sometimes forgetting to connect the dots. And so in physical setting source information, we would see the typical topographic maps and soil conservation maps and, you know, just basic general published information about physical setting sources. And then over in another section of the report, there would be discussion where the environmental professional actually read agency file records and had groundwater monitoring wells or boring logs that they reviewed related to an on-site or a neighboring site release that had actual site-specific physical setting source information, and they didn't connect the two. So there was inconsistent information, and it was huge. In some cases, assumptions on groundwater gradient was completely different than what the actual monitoring wells were saying, and they never got that incorporated back into the physical setting source information. So all the assumptions made in the government records section of their report reflected the assumptions, which was inconsistent with the actual on-site data, and all of the assumptions for up gradient, down gradient, cross gradient determinations made in the government records section was it was all wrong. So there's just a statement now in the physical setting source section of the standard to say, you know, you must review your topographic maps, and you must incorporate any physical setting source, the physical setting source information that you obtained pursuant to your government records review. Make sure you're going with the facts. So the government environmental records section has been updated. This is something EPA's had, our EPA liaison has had her eye on for quite some time. All of you know that when EPA restructured and developed their SEMS, you know, their Superfund Enterprise Management System structure, we just updated the database section to be less specific about the names of databases and more descriptive of the type of information that we were looking for. But the function of it all hasn't changed, just some of the naming. And then the big one really is the historical research. That's really where there's been so much effort, and it's still ongoing. And we needed to really answer a couple of questions. So the 1527-13 says, and the prior version says, use only as many historical resources as necessary to achieve the objectives. And the problem is this word only, I went too far, sorry. This word only, it implies a minimalistic level of effort that a certain segment of the environmental professional population took very, very seriously. Do only as much as you need to achieve the objectives, and not one brain cell more than what you think you need to do to reach a conclusion. And of all the parts of the standard that have the biggest risk right now in missing something, it has been inadequate historical research. Here's another example of that minimalistic approach. It says the standard says chain of title cannot be the only source of historical information. And what that suggested was that any of the other historical sources could be used in isolation. Get yourself a series of historical area photographs, and if you feel that answered your question, you're done. And again, there's a very certain segment of the environmental professional service provider population that took that very seriously. So we've had some real big problems, litigation and claims and things missed because of that. So the task group and the focus group and some industry groups have undertaken quite a bit of research to say, what is it we're really doing? What is good commercial customary practice, generally speaking? And what we found is that by and large, where available, most environmental professionals are checking the big four of those standard historical sources. If they're available, aerials, topos, fire insurance maps, city directories. For the most part, and it's not universal, and there are reasons why you wouldn't do certain things, but if those four resources are available, consultants are checking those out, right? So good commercial customary practices, yeah, you're looking at least those big four. And then EPs may use other resources depending on a variety of factors, right? So this is where the judgment thing comes in. Well, so that's a big adjustment from only do one if one is enough to, yeah, no, you know what, here's what most of the environmental professionals are doing, and this is what needs to be reflected in the standard. We had some recent litigation regarding insufficient review of adjoining properties. There's a lot of high risk with adjoining properties, right? And these are real situations that we're seeing where they got the gradient wrong. It's actually coming towards your property instead of going away because they didn't, the physical setting sources were assumed and then not accurate. One problem. Another is even so, if you have a tank or a release site that's right on your property boundary, gradient or no gradient, you have a higher impact, a higher likelihood of your site being impacted. Another thing that we were seeing, and it wasn't unusual, is property boundaries would change. You'd see a release site for an adjoining property that when you did the research, you find out that was actually part of your property. So there were just so many high risks associated with adjoining properties. We just knew we needed to address this. So EPs were currently interpreting 1527-13 differently, right? So what it says now is uses in the area surrounding the property shall be identified in the report, but this task is required only to the extent that that information is revealed while you're researching the property. So again, a third time we have this minimalistic encouragement in the standard, and we needed to fix that. So but the other thing that's interesting when you take a look at the 1527, where it currently says that when you're looking at surrounding properties, the time and cost involved in reviewing surrounding uses need to be considered. For example, aerials, it's pretty easy because it's a big picture, but you don't want to be reviewing tax files for adjacent properties. It might be too cumbersome, and this is in 1527, reviewing local city directories for more than a few streets may be too time consuming, right? So your standard already tells you you should at least be looking next door. If the standard's saying, more than a few streets away might be too time consuming, you need to at least be looking next door. So we're continuing that discussion and industry outreach, and we're meeting almost every week. And this one's been one of the most challenging to get through. The site visit, there were just some clarifications on site visit. Again, there's been some recent litigation regarding site visits. If there's something bad out there, of course, they're going to ask, why didn't you see it? So there's some language proposed in the site visit section. I think we just wrapped most of this up last week, addressing the comments, clarifying what do we do when we're on the site visit and what is it that we need to put in the report so it's clear to the user what it was that we did during the site visit. Here was one that just came up in last week's call that was interesting with respect to interviews. We're going through the ballot comments on sections 10 and 11 right now. And there's this one section right now in 10.7.2 of the 2013 and probably all the way back to 1993. And it says, when you're needing to interview a non-user, right, an owner, a tenant, or somebody who's just not talking to you, and it says this section shall not thereby be deemed incomplete, provided that, there's a couple of things, but the second one is funny, provided that the questions have been asked in writing, sent by first-class mail or by private commercial carrier, right? Who does that anymore? Nobody does that anymore. But it's a little hiccup, right? If somebody comes out of the woodwork that the environmental professional did not contact. And so we knew we needed to modernize that portion of the standard. Let's see what about what goes into the report, right? More robust and detailed reporting requirements, but I need to be careful when I say that, because bulk is not necessarily beneficial, right? We have these big cut and paste, auto-populate reports. What we see get missed is the thought process, the thinking, and quite frankly, quality writing. But so we're trying to, some of the revisions that we're looking at, and we'll be looking at the report revisions or the comments to the report revisions probably in the next couple of weeks. One of the things that we did do that was embraced was consistently referring to the subject property. We've seen there was a lot of inconsistencies in the standard about property, what is the property? And also consultants are seeing inconsistencies just out there in the industry on the use of how we're identifying the subject property. It could be a parcel. It could be, multiple parcels. It could be a suite. It could be a right-of-way, a parcel acquisition. So just clarity on what exactly the subject property that is the subject to the environmental site assessment. Users especially wanted to see the rationale in the opinion section of the report for the historical rec and the CREC. Now, good reports already do that because it's findings and opinions, but those opinions were not getting transferred into or brought up to that section of the report. But they wanted to see, again, those pieces connect, those dots connected. Also, some more robust and detailed discussion on how significant data gaps affect the EP's opinion. This is a difficult topic, and there's a couple of things that we were seeing. One is that we see in most reports that environmental professionals will have a significant data gaps or a data gap section where they will, enumerate or list or talk about their data gaps. What they don't know or what they could not get, but then it's never discussed again. And what the users wanted to see was something down in the conclusion section of the report that says, we have these conclusions, this is what we've just concluded, but remember, we had this significant data gap that we really don't know about this or this or this. So I don't know exactly how all that's going to play out. But there was just some challenges in the conclusion section of the report, making a statement, a conclusive statement, and yet if there was a significant data gap and something outstanding out there that they didn't know that affected their ability to reach conclusions, that needed to be highlighted. So you may very well see in the revisions, in the conclusion section of the report, conclusions and significant data gaps affecting your ability to identify recognized environmental conditions. Because remember, not all data gaps are significant, and not all significant data gaps impair your ability to reach a conclusion. So, I mean, it's got to be a substantial, significant data gap affecting your ability to identify recognized environmental conditions. And of course, the obvious challenge to that is, how do you know what you don't know? So it's significant data gaps are a challenge, but we're seeing what we can do to help. Oh, and then there was, please put in photographs. Yes, include photos. There is nothing in the standard that says that you need to have photographs. So user groups are wanting to see photographs. And map, give me a site map. Show me where I am on planet Earth, right? Give me information in a site map. And again, there's nothing in the current or previous standards that say that you need to include a site map in your documentation. So there are a couple of things those are a couple of things the user groups wanted to see. Let's see, what else? Oh, emerging contaminants, because we have the PFAS issue, which is a moving target, and even up until it's PFAS today, PFOS today, but could be something else in 8 years when we look at this standard again. So we couldn't speak to it as a constituent itself. Here's the challenge. The challenge is that the EPA is not responding. It's not a CERCLA hazardous substance, right? And that's what our standard addresses, is CERCLA hazardous substances. It's on its way, but it's just not there quite yet. So proposed clarifications in section 16 is a statement that in non-scope considerations, emerging contaminants, right? If it's not regulated yet, the EP is not held to being responsible for something that they're still trying to figure out. There's some additional discussion in the non-scope considerations that speaks to PFOS as an example. But we had to be really careful and carefully craft the language to make it clear that once that emerging contaminant is defined as a hazardous substance under CERCLA, as interpreted by EPA regulation in the courts, then these substances now are brought into the scope of the 1527. There is some controversy about this because it is regulated at the state level in some areas as well, but and we looked at how we could perhaps efficiently and effectively integrate state mandates and state requirements beyond just one statement that we make up in section 1 of the standard. And it just gets too complicated. It just gets too complicated to try to address all the different state nuances that could change much faster than the federal nuances. So that looks like that's the direction we're going with dealing with emerging contaminants, which, like I say, today is the PFOS issue. So I hear, how, and what people, of course, are concerned about is how will the 1527 changes affect me? I would say, first of all, be aware that they're coming, right? Know that they're coming, stay connected. Your data providers really are a great source of information to let you know the progress, the status, and when the time comes. Remember that changes reflect a compilation of industry input from all across the country. These are professionals who come to the task group. They share their own internal processes and structures, again, to reflect what is that good commercial customary practice. EPs who are producing quality deliverables, who are looking to the standard to meet the objectives, they're likely to see little change in your own processes. It might be some structural changes, but how you're presenting information, incorporating specifically the big four, just to demonstrate, yeah, well, and this is what you've been doing, and this is what we'll continue to do, but we'll structure it in your reports maybe a little differently, but your process really shouldn't change. If anything I'm sharing with you makes you uncomfortable or like nervous or angry, I would say double check the current standard, and you might want to see if you've maybe drifted away from the objectives, intents, the language that's in the current standard. and just do a double check if you feel you've been compliant. And again, the only reason these changes are that we're looking at these, very serious things have happened. Things have been getting missed consistently, not just, you know, a one-off here and there. So again, consistency in the process and consistency in the deliverable, that's what we're looking for. That's what I have for you for just, there's some other things that are in there, but you know, a lot of cleanup and cleaning up definitions and some inconsistencies that have just built over time. But did we have any questions, Scott?
Yes, we do. One thing I'd like to comment on, though, there is also reference in where you have to reference the historical information that you receive. I think that was actually good.
Yeah, and so that's an interesting thing. And again, remember I was talking about losing quality writing and you know, lack of adhering to just basic technical documents, right? And one of those are references. Good technical documents reference their sources. Right. How we drifted away from that, I'm not really sure, but apparently it's been bad enough that we need to remind our technical writers, because remember, environmental professionals, you are technical professionals. Your phase 1 environmental site assessment, you're a technical writer. So yeah, that was one of the. Yeah,
no, I was glad to see that, or see it coming, because I do see that quite a bit, and I think it does make a difference, because I've seen where somebody will reference a city directory and won't be proper, where they'll just do a general town and it could not be the right book, or they source aerial photography as themselves. So it'll be good. It makes it hard to replicate. And then go ahead.
And that is true. Let me just, and what the standard says is that you need to document your sources to the extent that another environmental professional can figure out what you did.
Right.
So even if you do, like you said, if they do, whatever the resource is, I might not be able to replicate it, but I will at least be able to know what you did and figure out, you know, when I'm reviewing your stuff.
Yeah, and I was really happy to see, you know, the language for AULs being cleared up, because we've found activities AULs back to 92. I think it's about the earliest we've seen where it was not conveyed to the next owner. So it was good. Let's start with a question. So we have quite a few, so let's see what we can do to get through some of these. I don't think we'll get through all of them. We have over 54 plus 55. It keeps going up. So let me start. About 8-year shelf life. Does it mean everyone using an older version will not stand up in court battle?
Oh, that's a very complex question, but I will tell you that EPA referenced the 2013 version as meeting all appropriate inquiries. And then after a certain period of time, and I think it was 6 months, then they removed their reference to the 05 version. That was EPA telling you they want you to be compliant with all appropriate inquiries. You need to be using the 2013 standard. Now, whether that use of an old standard would hold up in a court, I can't answer that. That's a lawyer question, but EPA made it clear in their references that they want you using the 2013, and we anticipate a similar result this time.
Okay. Hey, was there any discussion in, I guess, between the EPs about certification of environmental professionals at all?
That's always, yeah. So as you know, there is no nationally recognized, EPA has not recognized any certifying body for environmental professionals. There's some private certification programs, but until some agency or entity with power adopts that, no, there is no recognized, there is no certification for environmental professionals. People talk about it, and like I said, some private organizations have developed a program, but that's as far as it's gone.
Okay. Next question: how are the presence of radioactive materials or waste handled? Presence of high alpha or beta particles, in my experience, is being widely missed.
That's a very Well, it depends on what you're talking about. So, naturally occurring is excluded, right? Because it's a naturally occurring but I've had some in mining where I personally have called that decay as a because now we've altered something, right? Now we've made some kind of a change. And when I think about that, I think about Libby, Montana. And although asbestos is a naturally occurring mineral in its natural state, or asbestos being used inside its building for intended use is also non-scope. But when you have an asbestos release, then obviously EPA responded with a CERCLA action. There's some other things related to the Nuclear Regulatory Committee. It's just stuff that I'm not quite familiar with, but I'm just sharing how I've used or seen the radioactive concern either excluded from or built into the phase 1 process. I know that's not a good answer, but have somebody send me that as an email separately, and I can give them a better answer with people smarter than me.
Okay. Next question, is there a certain amount of time before a laundry at a property is no longer considered a wreck? For example,
good question. Like how far back?
Yeah, for example, if a property was listed on the Sanborn map as a laundry in the early 1900s, then residential since the year 1910, is the existence of the laundry still a concern in the year 2021?
So that's a really good question. And I've got a technical document that I use, that I reference, and the introduction of PCE in particular. PCE in the United States was like the 1930s or so. So there isn't anything specific in the standard, but it's a really good question. And before PCE, they were using things like kerosene and some other stuff. But for me personally, it's kind of that 1930s, mid-1930s mark. If I'm seeing a laundry on a Sanborn map, now this is just the world according to Julie. This is not ASTM task group chair. This is just my own research and input that I've received. Yeah, if I see a laundry on a 1910 fire insurance map, I am generally not concerned about it, and I reference that. Anybody who's interested in that research paper, I have it handy, Scott, and I can share it with you.
That'd be good.
Yeah, okay. It's a great research.
Okay. Next question, for HREX, does affecting subject property need proof, or can it be likely?
For an HREC? Another good question. You guys are awesome. So the HREC and CREC were developed and defined to require the data. What are you comparing to? If you don't have the data, you're just guessing. Now, I have seen people justify guessing. They'll say, yeah, you had a gas station here, but now it's a high rise with 4 levels of underground parking. And so even if there was a release, it's probably all gone now. Okay, that's not exactly the box that the HREC was defined as, but if you're good with guessing, I have seen people use it in that respect. But the definitions themselves, both HREC and CREC, they are defined in a manner in which you gotta have the data to compare to which level, right? I mean, I don't know about you all, but I've seen some gas stations that have releases that were pretty significant and went deeper than what 3 stories of underground parking would take out. But some are okay with guessing.
Okay, this is going to be related to PFAS. You made reference into your talk about that not on the EPA list. So how would you handle PFAS then? Would you need to have a statement whether PFAS were handled at the subject or adjacent properties?
What I'm generally seeing, again, as a broad brush, is that environmental professionals are addressing PFAS based on what's happening with their regulators in their state. Right. So looking to that part of 1527 that says you need to keep in mind state and local regulations. That's how I'm seeing most environmental professionals approaching PFAS and PFOS. I don't think that generally in the marketplace, EPs or anybody really understands exactly the extent. When you say, do you need to identify whether or not it's likely to have been something used on your property or an adjoining property? That's very complex, and that in and of itself is an emerging research project.
Okay.
I don't have a clear answer on that yet.
All right. Okay, this is going to be related to liens and AULs. Does a phase one meet the ASTM standard if the user chooses not to provide a lien or AUL search?
Yeah, no, good question. So the 1520, I need to quit saying that after every question. The 1527 says the EP, you need to ask. You need to ask the user and relay in your report what the user told you. So from the purposes of the 1527, as long as you have asked and they have chosen, the user has chosen not to provide that information, you've complied with the 1527. Now that is a very different question as to whether the user has complied with AAI. We're dealing with that with some of our regulators. They have to make sure that that component is completed to meet the AAI. But from the perspective of the environmental professional in the 1527, as long as you asked and you relay in your report what you did or did not receive from the user, you have complied with 1527.
Okay. Are there any anticipated updates regarding clarifying the expiration dates? We've had lots of questions in the past regarding when the clock starts ticking, specifically from the issue date of a report. Or
yeah, and of all the dates, the issue date of the report is the one that is not relevant. Okay. So the standard, again, people are interpreting it differently, but each one of those components has their own clock. So technically, as the buyer is approaching closing and they look at their report, if everything has been conducted within 180 days, they're good. If everything but the site visit, if the site visit is the only thing that was done over 180 days ago, well, the site visit technically needs to be redone. It's not the date of the report. That's the only date that is not relevant. Each of those pieces have their own clock. Okay. So yes, there has been a lot of work that has gone into clarifying the shelf life to appropriately reflect the 180 days and the 12-month mark and the 1-year mark.
Okay, next question. Can we say subject property hereafter referred to as the property, or is it recommended to use subject property every time?
Well, as an environmental professional, you can do it any way you want. We just found that it was very helpful to be consistent because the property, it gets, especially when you start talking about neighboring properties and down the street properties and release sites and government records, we've just seen so much confusion about just using the word property that my personal recommendation that reflects what the task group has gone through is just when you're talking about the subject property, say subject property. But there's no mandate that says you have to. You can do what you want.
Okay. Now this question I definitely love here. Any consideration on reducing database searches for highly urban areas?
Oh, I will tell you, that was one of the things that I was really hoping that we could accomplish with the updated standard, because I wanted to do something very similar to what was done with the vapor encroachment, where they gathered a lot of data and looked at typical areas of influence and how far things really went. I really was hoping that we could have that opportunity to do something very similar and at least reduce the search distance, because none of that's changed since 1993. None of that has changed since 1993. And this is not exactly the question they were asking, but I will tell you that EPA tried. She made it, she did take it to just kind of run it up the flagpole a little bit. What if we did some real studies and showed that leaking underground storage tanks by and large don't go out half a mile? Maybe we could got shut down really fast, because the likelihood of being able to get that through an EPA, because they would have to change their regulation, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, we can't. So that's the thing for approximate minimum search distances. Now the question, as I heard it, was actually reducing the databases themselves. So again, EPA reflected what was in the 1527 as being reasonable when the rule was made. So we're kind of married now. We can't reduce the databases, like which ones we look at, but do keep in mind that the data providers find a lot more databases than just what's in the standard. So there's where you may have some flexibility if you want to reduce the actual databases that you're searching. And again, you can always use environmental professional judgment going back to the search distances. You can use environmental professional judgment to reduce your search distances. The standard has always allowed you to do that. I just couldn't get it changed as a default.
Okay. If language regarding the need for photos is included, was there any consideration made when the consultant report preparer is not allowed to take photographs?
Interesting question. I don't think we have anything in there about that. I think what that would default to would be the limitations, like where you're not allowed to speak to the tenant, so you can't do an interview. No, that's a good point, and something that you would want to make sure that photographs are not included of this area due to tenant request or something like that. So it's easy enough to write around, but no, there isn't anything specific about that.
Okay.
Although
go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, unless I'll bring that up at the task group meeting.
Okay. Okay. The next question: the term historic recognized environmental condition is defined by ASTM as a past release of any hazardous substance or petroleum product that has occurred in connection with the property and has been addressed to the satisfaction of regulatory authority and or meeting unrestricted use criteria established authority.
Right.
So I think they're just making a statement.
So is there a question there?
No, I think they're just making a statement.
So, but since you're stating that, let me just say one of the big debates that we hear out there is, well, I don't have a no further action letter, or, I don't, but it was written to allow for like self-directed cleanups that meet a pre-adopted by the regulatory authority. That's why that phrase is there, regulatory authority that has adopted screening criteria. I don't know if that's where they were headed, but
yeah. Okay, I have a recent issue with naturally occurring asbestos. It's not a wreck until it's dug up, and it won't be dug up until construction starts. So at the time of my site visit, there is no wreck. Will this type of future issue be addressed in the new standard?
and are they talking? Were they talking about asbestos?
Yep.
Naturally
occurring.
Asbestos. Yeah. I would equate that to legally applied herbicides and pesticides, kind of the same thought. As long as it's left as it is, it's exempt, right? Because that's an application, not a release. Asbestos rock is, nature put it there. It's not a release. Definitely. So whatever conclusion, so the conclusion that you come to, it's not a wreck because, and I have seen this where, however, if there is, any disturbance or planned future development or anything like that, there's a risk of a release, or additional evaluation may be needed or something like that. Yes, that's when it becomes a wreck, is when you start. Then you have the release, right? The asbestos is released. Maybe the dust when you start digging up an old tobacco field or something like that. Can I go back to the previous question? And again, I'm only guessing what the commenter was saying, but we were talking earlier about the HREC and people guessing, and that might be what the commenter was referring to. And that's why I say the HREC was defined to require comparison of data to something, either, right? Some kind of cleaned up to the approval of a regulator or a regulatory authority, or all those words that they just used. And I think what the commenter might have been doing is supporting exactly what I was saying. Guessing is not what's built into the standard. I've seen some people do that, but to that point of the commenter, yeah, you need to have data.
Yeah. Has there been any discussions to the definitions of EPs in the?
There is always discussion about the definition of the EP, and there is always discussion about the role of the EP. So yes, there has been discussion, debate, arm wrestling, but nothing has changed there.
Okay. Any discussions or clarification of readily available and reasonably ascertainable language?
Yes, we had a focus group looking specifically at whether or not that 20 calendar days should be adjusted. Other than and after discussion and industry outreach and focus group contemplation, no change was recommended.
Okay. And I guess has there been any talk to the shelf life of the report?
Lots of talk. Yep, lots of talk. And part of what triggered that, one of them was the confusion, was the question that was brought up earlier. The other thing that has really triggered that is SBA's determination to drop the 880 days. Now you have to remember, SBA, all 5 of their senior team is and technical review team, they're all on our task group. And so we have SBA there. And it was really interesting to have one federal agency say one thing that contradicts the requirements of another federal agency. And SBA has told us, and I will share with you that if their decision to have dropped that 180-day shelf life mandate that's in AAI causes problems, if they start to see challenges, they may change their mind about that. But no, we did not change the shelf life at all. We just clarified.
Okay. So somebody wants to know, is it too late to get involved on the ASTM committee to revise the standard?
I wouldn't say it's too late if you're interested. I mean, anybody can join ASTM and participate in the discussions. If you want to get a better idea of what's going on, some of the discussions that have taken place, you are welcome to join that task group anytime. It is too late for new issues, really. But it's a really good way to, be on the forefront of what's happening. And then also after the standard comes out, right? I mean, if there's some big blip that we've created, we got to dig right back in quickly and fix it. So it's never too late.
Okay. And so what will happen in the period between December 2021 and I guess the to be determined date of 2022, the EPA adoption date of the new ASTM 1527-21 standard?
The same thing that happened the last time. There's kind of a lag where your 2013 is what you'll use. We really are, we're striving to make that time frame as small as possible. But your 1527-13 is, is going to be the what is referenced by AAI in that interim until they issue their acceptance of the new one.
Okay.
One of the things that we do to narrow that gap is that when we're almost done and we go through the balloting process, I hold the final negative. I hold the final negative that controls the timing of the release to give EPA. So everything else has been addressed. And so EPA can take that document and start through their approval process, so that our standard needs to be published when they publish their reference. But when she's close to being ready to publish, then I can let go of the negative, publish the standard, she publishes the rule. We try to minimize that lag time.
Okay. So what does the litigation landscape look like out there around this standard? Are there a lot of cases out there?
I don't know that I would say there's a lot of cases. I think what we had seen is more cases typically around due care, continuing obligations, and people not managing this stuff well going forward. You lose your landowner liability protections then. But really it's been some serious thing, poorly conducted site visits and inadequate historical research. Those have really been the two bigger issues.
Okay. We'll just do a few more questions here. I know we're a little bit past the top of the hour. We have a lot. We will not be able to get to them all. Julie, are you okay if after the fact try to answer some of these questions after the presentations?
Yeah,
Okay.
just send me the questions and it'll take me a few days to get to it, but I can get you
That's
some
fine.
responses back.
And we'll make sure we get those out to everybody.
Okay.
Okay. So my understanding was that the standard required that we have at least 2 historical sources that appropriately cover the history of the site. Is that still so?
Well, it's no. So what the standard says is you only need to the current 2013 version, and prior versions have said you only need to research as many historical sources as are necessary to achieve the objectives, and title cannot be the only one. Chain of title cannot be the only one. So there has been no number put on them. But what we are finding is that generally good commercial customary practice is a few, but good commercial customary practice, you're not just checking one, you're not just checking two, you're checking as many as necessary to get you that five-year historical timeline.
And we'll make this the last one, and then we'll get to the other questions. So please keep sending those and we'll make sure we get them answered. But how have you been seeing COVID-19 affecting the phase 1 process and outcome?
That's been very interesting. I'll tell you, that's been very interesting. And if we've ever had an example of how well crafted the 1527 is, that was a test. It's a data gap, right? COVID-19 is going to be a data gap. You can't get into a building, or you cannot get into a tenant space. I mean, that's what was happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was really interesting whether, and if you equate it to something like 6 feet of snow on the ground, which I've had, or a locked gate and you can't get in, or a client, when you put it in that context of other data gaps, other encumbrances, things that keep you from being able to achieve one of the objectives, treat it like a data gap. It's just a data gap, and you're going to have to make a decision. Consultant has to make a decision on whether or not that's a significant data gap that's affecting your ability to form opinions.
Yeah, and that's an interesting question. The reason I also brought it up, there's going to be a questionnaire sent out by ERIS GeoSearch and EDR. We're working together with the EBA on sending out a survey, so be looking out for that. And then the results of that will be presented at the EBA January conference here in a few weeks, I think, and we'll be talking about that. And then I think each of the companies will also provide those results as well independently. So anyway, well, Julie, thank you today for presenting. Appreciate it. Very informative. It was a great presentation. A lot of comments are coming through about it. So again, you did a great job and we appreciate that.
Well, good. Stay tuned.
Yes. Just let everybody know this presentation will be made available for viewing at our website at erisinfo.com. Also, you can follow us on LinkedIn at Environmental Risk Information Services or on Twitter at ERIS Information to get notified about future presentations. In addition, for those that attended today, we will send via email on how and where to obtain a certificate for today's presentation. Also, please contact us about any future topics that you would like to see. You can do that by calling us at 866-517-5204 or contact your regional account manager listed on the website, or just simply reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you. I truly wish everybody a happy 2021, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you again for attending today's webinar presentation on current state of the revision process for the ASTM E1527 standard. This now concludes and the end of today's webinar. Stay safe, stay healthy, and take care. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks,
You
everybody.
bet. Thanks, Julie.